They mocked his hayrack rifle. Then he silenced 9 Japanese scouts in 48 hours. The night of January 12th, 1943 on Guadalcanal was quiet in a way that made the Marines along the ridge uneasy. The air was cool, but the ground was still warm from the day, and a thin layer of condensation clung to helmets, rifles, and the exposed roots around the listening posts. The jungle in front of the American line looked like a single black wall. No moon filtered through the canopy, and even the distant surf seemed muffled. These conditions usually meant that the Japanese scouts were already out there, moving slowly, trying to find the weak points in the perimeter. Private Calvin Rourke, a 22-year-old rifleman from the 1st Marine Division, lay in a shallow scrape a few yards ahead of the main line. He had been positioned here because he had sharper hearing than most men in the platoon. Before the war, he worked long days on a small farm in Nebraska, where he learned to identify the movements of cattle, birds, and stray animals before the sun came up. Staff Sergeant Mallory had noticed that Rourke reacted to noises others missed and had assigned him repeatedly to forward listening duties. Rourke didn't complain. He followed orders and understood that the scouts weren't trying to kill individuals. They were trying to find information that could bring an entire Japanese assault force onto this very slope. His primary task was simple but critical: detect any enemy movement before it reached the wire. Once detected, he was to eliminate scouts quietly and without revealing his own position. Mallory had reminded him earlier that day that one Japanese scout slipping through could cost dozens of Marines their lives. If the enemy mapped this part of the ridge accurately, they could guide infiltrators straight into the battalion's flank. Beside Rourke lay the tool that had earned him constant jokes: a rifle strapped to a long bamboo pole, with a cord wrapped around his wrist that connected to the trigger. He had built it during a rare quiet hour a week earlier. The idea came from a hayrack device his father once used to scare birds without climbing ladders. The Marines had immediately started calling it the hayrack rifle. Some of them had laughed. Others warned it might get him shot by his own men. But Rourke had a practical reason for using it. Japanese scouts were trained to detect muzzle flashes and mark the exact location of a shot, passing that information back to their units. By firing the rifle at a point offset from his real position, Rourke made it harder for the enemy to pinpoint him. It wasn't elegant, but it was functional. He slid one glove off his hand to make better contact with the ground. The soil was damp, and small insects moved near his fingers. He ignored them. His attention was on the faint sounds coming from ahead. Nothing clear yet, but there was a tension in the brush that didn't exist earlier in the night. Rourke stayed completely still, breathing through his nose, letting his hearing adjust. Behind him, hidden by darkness, Mallory and the rest of the squad maintained their positions. Their rifles were ready, but they depended on Rourke to give a first signal. Nobody spoke. Nobody shifted. Even the small click of a safety being adjusted felt too loud in this environment. Then it came, a short, crisp break of a twig. Not from falling debris, not from an animal, but from deliberate weight. Rourke's muscles tightened. He raised his left hand slightly, giving the silent signal that one or possibly two scouts were approaching. The squad behind him responded by lowering their breathing and preparing to fire if necessary, but they stayed silent. Their task was simple: hold the line unless Rourke identified a threat. Rourke slowly lifted the bamboo pole. He didn't move the rifle fast. Any sudden shift could alert the scout. Instead, he guided the pole forward by a few inches at a time, aligning the muzzle toward a patch of blackness where the sound had come from. He didn't rely on sight. At this distance, visibility was almost zero. He used the timing of faint breaths, the drag of cloth against leaves, and the steady, practice crawl that Japanese scouts were trained to use. A darker shape finally separated from the rest of the jungle. For a moment, Rourke saw the rounded rim of a helmet, then the faint outline of a bayonet angled low to avoid reflecting light. The scout was moving carefully, pausing every few seconds to let the jungle reset. Rourke tightened the cord around his wrist. He exhaled quietly. His finger brushed the wooden grip taped to the pole. When the scout paused again, he pulled. The rifle fired from the offset position with a single sharp crack. The recoil traveled down the bamboo pole and into his arms. The scout dropped without making a sound. Leaves shifted slightly, then settled. Mallory whispered from behind him, barely audible, "That's one." Rourke didn't react. He immediately cycled the bolt, catching the casing before it hit the ground. His hands were steady, trained from months of repetitive motion. He knew scouts rarely traveled alone. Seconds later, another controlled movement came from the right side of the first body. Slightly faster, slightly closer. The second scout was adjusting position to investigate the noise. Rourke angled the pole again. This time he had less time. The scout's movement was more direct, and the angle was narrow. He pulled the cord once more. The second shot broke the stillness. Another body fell. The jungle swallowed the sound quickly. No one behind him moved. No one celebrated. The squad simply absorbed the information. 2 scouts eliminated before reaching the wire meant their line was still undiscovered. Rourke lowered the pole and listened again. The jungle held steady. No more movement. No more faint breaths. The immediate danger had passed. He wiped moisture from his forehead, but his expression remained focused. The night was far from over. This was likely only the first pair. If more scouts came, they would come quieter, slower, and more determined. Rourke's job was to detect them before they detected him. The platoon's task was to hold the ridge at all costs. As he settled back into position, Rourke didn't think about the praise he might receive or the jokes that would stop. He thought about what would happen if just one scout slipped through. He tightened the cord on his wrist once more, adjusted the bamboo pole, and waited for the next sound. The jungle remained silent, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way. The first light of dawn came slowly on Guadalcanal, spreading through the trees in faint gray bands rather than a clear sunrise. The jungle canopy filtered everything, turning morning into a dim blur that barely improved visibility. The Marines along the ridge adjusted their positions, checking rifles, stretching cramped legs, and trying to shake off the stiffness that came from lying motionless all night. The sounds of insects rose again, filling the air with a constant hum, but beneath it was the steady awareness that the Japanese scouts would return. Private Calvin Rourke stayed near the listening post even as the rest of the platoon rotated positions. He brushed soil from his sleeves and wiped the condensation from his rifle. His face showed the strain of the night. Tightened jaw muscles, reddened eyes, shallow breathing that came not from fear but from exhaustion after hours of focus. Still, he stayed alert. Scouts he had eliminated were only part of a bigger pattern. Their movements suggested testing, not a withdrawal. The Japanese rarely sent only one team. They studied reactions, counted intervals, and returned at angles that made tracking them difficult. It was likely they were already planning another approach. Staff Sergeant Mallory approached, squatting beside him. His uniform was soaked from the night's humidity, and mud streaked one side of his helmet. He looked at the bodies in the brush, but said nothing about them. Instead, he spoke just above a whisper. "You'll stay on the forward line again tonight. You've got the best ears in the platoon, and whoever's commanding their scouts knows this terrain. Your shots didn't reveal your position. That bought us time." Rourke nodded. He didn't show pride. He understood the responsibility more than the compliment. The fact that the scouts hadn't found the wire meant the Japanese unit behind them had no updated information about Marine strength along this sector. If a full infiltration attempt came without an accurate guide, it would likely break apart before reaching the ridge. His task wasn't about personal skill. It was about preventing the enemy from gaining a foothold. Mallory's expression shifted slightly, showing the concern he usually kept hidden. "Get some rest. You'll need it. Tonight won't be easier." Rourke moved back toward the company area to eat a small breakfast, canned meat, bread, and cold coffee. He ate quickly, watching the tree line the entire time. Around him, the Marines tried to act casually, but their movements betrayed tension. Boots scraped the dirt a little more sharply. Rifles were checked twice. Men spoke in short sentences. Even those who joked did so with a stiffness that didn't fit their words. Throughout the day, supply runners brought ammunition forward, and the platoon redistributed rations. Lieutenant Crandall gathered the squad leaders for a short briefing. Rourke could hear parts of it as he cleaned his rifle. Radio operators farther up the ridge had intercepted fragments of Japanese messages that suggested increased reconnaissance activity. The enemy wanted a gap, a blind spot, a place where the Marines were thin, and scouts were the tool they used to find it. As evening approached, clouds gathered overhead, dimming the already weak light. The jungle took on a different character as shadows lengthened between the trees. The Marines began moving to their night positions. The familiar sound of metal clicking against metal echoed along the ridge as magazines were seated and bolts were checked. Rourke carried the bamboo pole with him, the cord wrapped neatly around his wrist once more. Some Marines glanced at it with the same skepticism as before, though their expressions were quieter now. Last night's results had changed the tone. By full darkness, the ridge was completely covered in blackness again. The men settled into silence. Crickets continued their steady noise, but even they sounded more distant in the heavy air. Rourke pressed his ear toward the ground in short intervals, listening for any sign of movement. The earth was damp and cool. It transmitted vibrations well. This method had taught him as much as listening above ground. Just after midnight, a faint shift in the brush caught his attention. It was soft, barely enough to disturb a leaf. But the rhythm was controlled, unlike the random scurrying of small animals. Rourke lifted one finger in warning. Mallory, somewhere behind him, motioned for complete stillness. Another sound followed. A slow drag, a pause, then another drag. The pattern indicated multiple individuals moving with caution. Likely scouts. They were returning, just as expected. Rourke raised the bamboo pole again and allowed his eyes to adjust. Through the dark shapes of the vegetation, he began to distinguish a slightly altered outline, something crawling toward the right flank of the wire. The scout was moving at a pace meant to blend with the natural shifts of the jungle, advancing inches at a time. A second shadow followed, slightly behind him. They were working in pairs again. He positioned the rifle slowly, waiting for the precise moment when the scout paused. Timing mattered more than aim. A poorly timed shot would alert the second scout before Rourke could reposition. He listened for the controlled breath, the brief stillness that preceded another movement. When it came, he pulled the cord. The rifle fired from the offset position. The scout collapsed with a quiet rustle, his body sinking into the brush. The second scout froze. In that hesitation, Rourke shifted the pole a few degrees and pulled again. The second shot echoed across the ridge, and the second body dropped just as silently as the first. Behind him, no one spoke. Every Marine understood that this wasn't the end of the night. 2 scouts eliminated meant the Japanese would adjust again. They often sent a third man trailing the pair, watching from a distance, sometimes waiting to mark an opening if the others failed. Rourke wiped condensation from his hands and slowly repositioned the pole. His breathing remained steady, though his eyes showed the strain of constant vigilance. He listened again, filtering through layers of jungle noise. Minutes passed. The silence felt heavier than before. Then another faint movement reached him. Farther away, slower, more careful. A single scout, likely the observer. Rourke didn't rush. He watched the darkness, waiting for any shift in shape, any sign that the enemy was trying a new angle. When he finally saw a slight motion near a fallen tree trunk, he angled the bamboo pole again and waited for the scout to settle. The shot was quick and deliberate. The third body slumped behind the log. Rourke lowered the pole. His face remained expressionless. He had been awake too long to feel accomplishment. His only thought was that the line held for another hour. The platoon stayed safe. The scouts hadn't reached the wire, but he also knew the pattern was changing. 3 scouts in the first night. 3 more now. They were testing the ridge with increasing frequency. This wasn't an isolated reconnaissance. It was preparation for something larger. He adjusted his helmet and tightened the cord around his wrist. The night wasn't over, and the scouts would come again. By mid-morning on January 13th, 1943, word had already moved through the platoon about what happened during the night. 3 more scouts had been stopped before reaching the wire, and the men began to understand that the strange bamboo-mounted rifle system was more than a novelty. Marines who had laughed at it earlier kept their opinions to themselves. Some still eyed the contraption with confusion, but they no longer dismissed it. What mattered now was the effect. The scouts were not breaking through. Private Calvin Rourke rubbed his eyes with the back of his wrist, trying to clear the fatigue that had set in after 2 nights of almost constant focus. He had slept briefly in the early morning, no more than an hour, lying in mud that had cooled rapidly with the arrival of daylight. Sleep on Guadalcanal was never restful. Even during short breaks, men woke at the slightest sound, convinced they heard enemy movement that wasn't there. The tension built up in their bodies until every muscle responded to phantom threats. Throughout the camp area, Marines cleaned weapons, filled canteens, and repaired torn clothing. A supply runner brought a crate of ammunition from the rear, and men quickly divided it among themselves. They had learned to carry more rounds than they were likely to use, because nights on the ridge could shift suddenly into long firefights. The Japanese forces in the nearby jungle were unpredictable, often silent for days before launching rapid, intense attacks with little warning. Lieutenant Crandall gathered the squad leaders in a small clearing. His voice was steady but firm as he relayed the latest intelligence. Radio operators on the ridge had intercepted fragments of Japanese transmissions indicating increased reconnaissance activity along several sections of the perimeter. The enemy was attempting to map the weakest points. If they succeeded, a major infiltration could strike the ridge and roll into the defensive network protecting Henderson Field. Crandall pointed toward the tree line as he spoke, emphasizing that any scouts slipping through would jeopardize not only the platoon, but the entire operation on Guadalcanal. Staff Sergeant Mallory returned to the platoon after the briefing. He approached Rourke, lowering himself to sit beside him on an overturned ammunition crate. Mallory's uniform was dark with sweat and dirt, and a cut on his forearm from the previous night had started to reopen. He closed it with a strip of cloth without reaction. Physical discomfort was something every Marine had learned to ignore. "You'll be on the forward line again tonight," Mallory said. "Higher command knows what you've been doing. They want that listening post held exactly as it is. If scouts reach the wire, we lose the advantage we have left." Rourke nodded once. His eyes were unfocused, not from disinterest but from the exhaustion tightening behind them. The responsibility placed on him weighed heavily. He was not being asked to fight in close-range assaults, where adrenaline helped carry men forward. He was being asked to wait, stay still for hours, use minimal movement, and rely entirely on hearing to detect enemy presence. It required a level of patience that few men possessed under stress. "You holding up?" Mallory asked quietly. "I'm fine," Rourke answered. His tone was flat, but sincere. He didn't complain because he believed every man on the line faced something difficult. His job was simply different. As the afternoon progressed, humidity thickened. Clouds gathered over the island, darkening the sky hours before sunset. The men spent their remaining daylight checking the perimeter, reinforcing weak spots in the wire, and clearing small fields of fire without leaving noticeable disturbances that scouts could detect. It was slow work, done carefully and without unnecessary sound. Rourke took time to adjust the bamboo pole, tightening the bindings around the rifle to ensure the recoil wouldn't loosen them during the night. He tested the cord several times, pulling it with different levels of tension to confirm that the trigger reacted consistently. The system was crude, but it gave him an advantage the enemy did not expect. He could fire without exposing the exact location of his body. In a jungle where muzzle flashes were often the only visible targets, this mattered. By dusk, the platoon moved into night positions. The jungle seemed to press closer as darkness gathered. Men checked their rifles and set aside extra ammunition within easy reach. Lieutenant Crandall passed quietly along the line, reminding the Marines to conserve sound and avoid revealing their strength with unnecessary movement. Night took hold quickly, swallowing the ridge in layers of pitch-black stillness. Rourke settled into the listening post, feeling the cool ground through his uniform. He placed one hand lightly onto the soil, using the faint vibrations to supplement what his ears detected. The bamboo pole lay beside him, ready to lift at the first sign of movement. It did not take long. Just after 1 o'clock, the sounds returned. Soft at first, so soft that only someone trained to isolate small disturbances would notice. Then clearer, a slow, deliberate crawl through the brush. 2 or more individuals. Their spacing was wider than the previous night, suggesting they had studied the terrain and adjusted their approach. Scouts often changed angles, choosing paths overlooked before. Rourke raised his left hand to signal contact. The platoon behind him froze. He brought the bamboo pole up again, positioning the rifle with slow movements. Visibility was nearly non-existent. Only the faintest shifts in the outline of the vegetation hinted at where the enemy moved. He waited for the pause in their crawl, the moment when the scouts listened for danger. He heard it, controlled breathing, a brief stop, then the soft drag of knees against the earth. He pulled the cord. The shot cracked from the offset position, and a body dropped instantly. The second scout reacted faster than the ones before, shifting direction and trying to disappear into a small depression in the ground. Rourke followed the faint noise and fired again. The second shot caught the scout before he could retreat. The jungle went still for several seconds. Then Rourke heard something different, a careful, measured shift farther back. A third scout. He was slower, more cautious, likely observing from a distance to assess the response to the first 2 deaths. Rourke steadied the pole again, waited for the slightest indication of the scout's position, and fired a third time. The sound was identical to the others, short, sharp, controlled. The body fell behind a cluster of low-sitting ferns. Behind him, the Marines did not react with relief. They remained silent, understanding that this was not an end but a continuation. 3 scouts in one night meant persistent pressure, and the number of scouts encountered in such a short span suggested a coordinated effort rather than isolated reconnaissance. Rourke lowered the bamboo pole and remained still. His breathing was slow, but he felt the weight of 2 nights with almost no real rest. The scouts were probing more aggressively. Their patterns were increasing in frequency. It was no longer simply a matter of detecting them. It was a matter of understanding what larger movement they were preparing for. He settled back into position, knowing the night had hours left. The next approach could come at any time, and he had to remain ready. As the third night on the ridge approached, the humidity increased until the air felt heavy enough to slow breathing. By dusk, a layer of fog began forming near the treetops. At first it was thin and scattered, drifting between the branches. Then it thickened, lowering across the ridge, swallowing the last traces of daylight. The Marines had dealt with rain, heat, and lack of sleep, but fog was its own danger. It dissolved their sight lines and made every sound harder to judge. Private Calvin Rourke returned to the forward listening position just after darkness settled. He moved with steady steps, careful not to disturb anything that might reveal activity to the enemy scouts. His uniform was still damp from the short rain earlier that afternoon, and the fabric clung to his arms. The exhaustion in his eyes was obvious, but he remained alert. The pattern of enemy movements over the previous 2 nights indicated they would return again, likely with more caution and possibly in greater numbers. Rourke placed the bamboo pole beside him and settled into the shallow scrape. The ground felt colder now, and moisture coated everything, including the pole, the cord, and his rifle. He wiped each surface with a rag, ensuring nothing slipped when he raised it. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Mallory arranged the men quietly, checking each Marine's spacing and reminding them to keep their weapons ready but silent. The men were tired, their movements slower than the nights before, but the tension in their posture showed they understood the stakes. The fog thickened further, forming a dense layer that restricted visibility to a few feet. Even silhouettes disappeared into a shapeless gray mass. Rourke relied on sound alone. He placed his palm on the ground again, feeling the faint vibrations that traveled through the soil. This method had helped him detect several scouts the previous night. Tonight, with the fog eliminating visual cues entirely, it became even more important. Just before midnight, the noises began. The first sound was faint, an irregular disturbance in the brush, followed by a short pause. Then another, slow, measured, almost inaudible. Rourke lifted his left hand, signaling contact. Mallory tightened the line behind him. A low, almost granular rustle came next. It was the sound of knees and elbows moving over wet leaves. Then a soft exhale, controlled and deliberate. Rourke recognized the pattern. Japanese scouts moved in this exact rhythm when approaching wire obstacles. Crawl, stop, listen, crawl again. He raised the bamboo pole carefully. The fog made it impossible to distinguish shapes, but he looked for disruptions in the thick gray. Any slight movement or shift in density could indicate a figure. He waited, focusing on the sound rather than sight. Another rustle, this one closer. A shadow emerged, a darker shape within the fog. The scout was crawling low, probably with his rifle slung across his back to reduce noise. Behind him, Rourke detected a second movement, slightly more to the left. A second scout was circling wider to find an unguarded angle. A third sound followed moments later, farther back but moving steadily forward. 3 scouts again. Rourke tightened the cord around his wrist and angled the rifle slightly to the right. He waited for the scout to pause. When the sound of movement stopped for a fraction of a second, he pulled the cord. The rifle fired from the offset position. The shot echoed across the ridge, and the first scout fell immediately into the brush. The second scout reacted with a short, sharp motion. He shifted position, trying to disappear into a pocket of foliage. Rourke tracked the movement by sound. He shifted the pole again and fired a second shot. The second scout collapsed, his body settling quietly into the undergrowth. The third scout didn't retreat. Instead, he froze behind a fallen log, waiting. Rourke recognized the tactic. The Japanese often placed a trailing scout to observe how the Marines responded to contact. He waited several seconds, listening for the scout's next move. The fog distorted the exact location, but the faint scrape of fabric gave him the direction. He fired a third time. The impact was followed by silence. The fog absorbed the sound quickly, leaving the jungle unnaturally still. Behind Rourke, B Company remained motionless. The Marines didn't celebrate, didn't whisper, didn't shift. Every man knew that 3 scouts appearing this early in the night was a sign of larger activity. Scouts rarely acted alone on nights like this. Their job was to confirm terrain features, gaps, and positions for a larger force waiting deeper in the jungle. Mallory leaned forward from his position behind the scrape. His voice was low and controlled. "That's 9 in 2 days." Rourke didn't reply. He kept listening. The ridge remained quiet for nearly a minute. Then a different sound emerged from deeper in the jungle. It wasn't the crawl of scouts. It was heavier, more coordinated movement. Multiple individuals adjusting gear, shifting into position, and communicating in low whispers. Mallory heard it too. He turned his head slightly, scanning the tree line. They're assembling. Not scouts. Not a patrol. Something bigger. Rourke raised the bamboo pole again, but Mallory placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Hold. Keep your position. If they come, we need to know where they're trying to break." Fog drifted between them, dulling the glow of the faint moonlight. The jungle was no longer silent. It held the restrained tension of men preparing to move. Somewhere out there, officers were issuing orders. Troops were settling into attack formations. The ridge was being studied, assessed, targeted. The scout team had failed to reach the wire, but the larger unit had not yet abandoned their plan. The fog offered them cover. The ridge offered the Marines limited sight. The night could shift at any moment. Rourke adjusted his grip, feeling the damp cord tighten around his wrist once more. His hands were cold, his eyes burning from lack of rest. He understood that what happened next would determine whether the previous 2 nights of effort had mattered. The Japanese force was out there, preparing, repositioning, waiting for the right moment. Rourke lowered himself closer to the ground, the bamboo pole ready at his side. The ridge braced for what might come through the trees next. The fog remained over the ridge past midnight, thick enough that even the nearest trees were reduced to faint outlines. The Marines along the line stayed quiet, watching the darkness in front of them while listening for changes in sound that would indicate an approaching force. Every man understood that the activity they had heard earlier was not a routine movement. A larger Japanese force was preparing to test the ridge. Whether it would be a probing attack or a full infiltration attempt was impossible to know, but the pattern of scouts over the last 48 hours suggested that the enemy was ready to act. Private Calvin Rourke remained in the forward listening post with the bamboo-mounted rifle beside him. His clothes were soaked from humidity and sweat. His fingers felt stiff from gripping the pole through long nights without real rest. His eyes burned, but he forced himself to stay alert. His job was unchanged: detect the enemy before they reach the wire and prevent them from identifying the exact layout of the Marine positions. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Mallory moved carefully along the line, checking each man's ammunition and reminding them to stay low. The fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet, but sound carried strangely in it. A single misplaced footstep could alert the enemy. Mallory paused behind Rourke for a moment. When they move, they'll move fast. Keep your fire offset. Confuse them as long as you can. Rourke nodded, not looking back. He had already tightened the cord on his wrist and checked the bamboo bindings twice. The pole felt heavier tonight. The strain from the previous 2 nights had built up in his arms and shoulders. Still, he positioned the pole so he could lift it in one motion without scraping on the ground. The jungle ahead of him remained quiet for several minutes. Then, little by little, the sounds began to change. A faint creak of equipment, a whispered order in Japanese, metal brushing against fabric, boots shifting weight in damp soil. It wasn't a scout team now. This was larger. Multiple groups repositioning at once. Mallory crouched low. "They're out there," he whispered. "They're trying to organize without their scouts. They don't know where the line is." This was the advantage the platoon had earned. Without scouts returning with accurate information, the Japanese unit preparing to infiltrate the ridge lacked precise guidance. They were guessing, and guessing in a night fog meant hesitation. Rourke listened intently. Despite the larger force, the enemy was trying to move quietly. They advanced in small clusters, adjusting direction frequently. The fog forced them to rely on memory and instinct more than sight. It also forced them to pause and check their surroundings repeatedly. Every delay increased the Marines' advantage. Then at 1:20 something shifted. The rustling became more deliberate. The enemy was preparing to advance. Mallory raised one hand to signal the platoon. "Hold positions. Don't fire unless they expose themselves. Let them get confused." The Japanese moved in uneven lines. Some reached the edge of the clearing, while others stayed deeper in the brush. Their formation was already breaking apart. They were searching for the safe approach that their scouts were supposed to provide. Instead, they had nothing. Rourke lifted the bamboo pole. He angled it slightly right, where he sensed the densest movement. He waited for an indication, anything that confirmed a target. A silhouette appeared through the fog. A Japanese soldier shifted behind a fallen palm trunk, his body angled forward as if preparing to signal others. Rourke pulled the cord. The shot burst from the offset position. The muzzle flash appeared several feet away from where Rourke actually lay. The Japanese soldier collapsed instantly. The reaction from the enemy was immediate and disorganized. Several soldiers turned toward the flash, while others retreated slightly, unsure where to focus. Officers spoke urgently, trying to regain control of the formation. Mallory leaned closer to the ground. "Keep at it. Keep them guessing." Rourke adjusted the pole and fired again at another silhouette moving in the wrong direction. The Japanese soldiers shifted toward the phantom firing point, spreading themselves into the thicker brush. They were now reacting to a false position, and their coordination faltered further. More movement followed. Another soldier, then 2 more behind him. Rourke continued firing at intervals, each shot angled differently to exaggerate the illusion of multiple Marine positions. Every round he fired caused more confusion. Japanese NCOs attempted to reorganize their men, but they were reacting to shots from a point that had no Marine behind it. Behind Rourke, the Marines held their positions. They did not reveal themselves. They allowed the enemy to misinterpret the battlefield. Mallory whispered, "They can't find the wire. They don't know if the ridge is directly ahead or if they're already at the flank." The Japanese movement grew more scattered. Some soldiers shifted left, others right. A small group retreated deeper into the jungle, likely believing they had stumbled into the wrong sector. The fog distorted their perception even further. Rourke's hands began to shake from fatigue, but he steadied them. He had fired repeatedly, and each shot had bought the platoon more time. He reloaded again, his fingers moving despite the numbness settling into them. By 3 o'clock, the pattern changed. The rustling grew distant. The Japanese voices became less frequent. The force that had gathered to infiltrate the ridge was now pulling back, uncertain of their surroundings, disorganized by the lack of scout intelligence, and misled by Rourke's offset firing. The night quieted again. The fog remained, but the danger passed. Rourke lowered the pole slowly. His arms felt heavy, his breathing slowed, and his uniform clung to him with dampness from exertion and sweat. He didn't speak. He placed the pole beside him and rested his hand on the ground again, listening for any sounds of a renewed approach. Mallory crouched beside him. His voice was low, steady, and without exaggeration. "You stopped them. The wire stayed hidden because of what you did." Rourke didn't answer. His expression showed exhaustion more than pride. He simply looked into the fog, aware that the scouts would return another night, and that he would be there again, listening, waiting, and holding the line. The ridge was quiet by the time the sun rose on January 14th, 1943. The fog had thinned into scattered patches that drifted between the trees, exposing the outlines of the Marine positions that had been hidden through the night. The men moved stiffly, their bodies tight from hours of stillness. Every Marine understood that the previous 48 hours had been different from the usual skirmishes. The pattern of scouts, the confused movements in the fog, and the partial withdrawal of the Japanese force all pointed to a failed infiltration attempt. Something larger had been prevented. Private Calvin Rourke remained near the forward listening post as the light improved. He sat with his back against a tree, holding the bamboo pole across his knees. His uniform was soaked with sweat and condensation. His hands showed deep marks where the cord had cut into his skin. He blinked slowly, adjusting to daylight after another night of almost no sleep. He wasn't thinking about the number of scouts he had shot or the disorganized retreat of the Japanese unit. He was focused on breathing steadily and staying alert until Mallory dismissed him. Staff Sergeant Mallory approached with Lieutenant Crandall a few minutes later. Crandall carried a small notebook used for after-action summaries. His helmet was pushed slightly back on his head, revealing lines of fatigue across his forehead. He looked at the bamboo pole first, examining it with a long, measured stare. Then he turned his attention to Rourke. "You kept the line stable," Crandall said. His voice remained calm, but there was a clarity in his tone that indicated the significance of the statement. Scouts didn't reach the wire. Their infiltration group never found a safe path. "We're reporting limited enemy contact and no breach," Mallory added quietly. "They were trying to find a way through. They couldn't. You bought us time they didn't expect." Rourke nodded once, but didn't respond verbally. He lacked the energy for explanations or acknowledgement. His breathing remained shallow, and his expression unchanged. He knew what he had done, but he also understood what could have happened if he had failed even once. A single scout slipping through could have changed the situation. The platoon spread out through the immediate area, checking for signs of any enemy soldiers who might have remained behind. They found none near the wire. The bodies of the scouts Rourke had eliminated the night before were located quietly in the brush. The Marines moved them with care, documenting their positions and equipment. The scouts were lightly equipped, carrying only rifles, maps, and small marking tools, evidence that their mission had been reconnaissance, not combat. Crandall wrote the details into his notebook. His after-action report would list the results in simple, factual terms. Enemy reconnaissance prevented. Multiple scouts neutralized before reaching Marine positions. No infiltration. Enemy force withdrew. The report wouldn't include the number of hours Rourke had remained awake or the strain of firing repeatedly in the fog without giving away his true location. It wouldn't describe the tension of waiting for sounds that might decide whether the ridge held or fell. Official documents rarely captured those details. As the morning continued, the men were finally allowed to rest. Rourke took a position under a low tree, letting his back sink into the rough bark. He rested the bamboo pole beside him. His arm shook slightly from fatigue. He closed his eyes, but didn't sleep immediately. His mind remained in the rhythm of the night, listening for movements, tracking pauses, anticipating danger. It took several minutes for the urgency to fade. Mallory checked on him once more before stepping away. The sergeant's tone remained steady. "Get some sleep. There's no telling what tonight brings." Rourke nodded again. For a moment, the ridge felt peaceful. The fog rose slowly, lifting the weight of the night. The jungle sounds returned to normal. Steady insect noise, distant bird calls, and the faint rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. But underneath the calm, the Marines understood the truth. The enemy scouts would return eventually. Another infiltration attempt would come. The ridge held for now because one Marine had kept the wire hidden and denied the enemy the information they needed. Rourke didn't think about recognition or praise. He thought about the task ahead, the nights he would return to the scrape, and the sound of crawling in the brush. He thought about the cost of missing even one movement. The bamboo pole rested quietly in the mud beside him. It looked simple and unimpressive, a tool assembled for necessity rather than design. Yet its presence on the ridge had changed the outcome of a battle that never fully began. As Rourke finally closed his eyes and drifted towards sleep, the ridge remained secure, held together by exhaustion, discipline, and the actions of a single Marine who refused to let the enemy see what lay behind the wire.